students, the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. School of Public Health is a long walk across campus. I made that walk today. I celebrate you. If you made that drive today, I appreciate you. It is a long distance between us, but it's not a long distance between the work that we do. And so today is really designed with that in mind. Bringing research and practice about how table later on today to facilitate a really meaningful coming together by our two schools. So we're very excited for that. Like I said, about 9 presentations, 10 minutes each. I know you're going to have questions for the presenters, and I've been asked to save those questions until the end of each section of the presentation. So there'll be a chance for the presenters to come together and answer those questions that you have, followed by a social just outside of this room. Is that where we're going?
It'll be outside and inside. There's
Yeah,
lots
so
outside.
good party, lots of food. We like to come together and celebrate. So please stay and celebrate with us. I know we're always in a rush to get on to the next thing, but give yourself permission today to learn, listen, and dream a little bit about the next chapter of your work together. So I'll turn it over to you, Tara.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. As you know, at the beginning of school, that's when we find out who's going to get sick first. We do have one of the presenters who comes down with an illness, so will not be able to present today. But I do want to thank all of the presenters. It's early in the semester. It's always a lot of work to get a presentation done right at the beginning. And just at the onset, thank you so much for contributing. And we really look forward to hearing your work. So we have 8 presenters. Each one will have about 10 minutes, so you can go a little over because we're down 1 presenter. And we're going to try and stick to the schedule. So our first one is Jennifer Roberts, and I'm going to advance to her slide.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thank you, everyone. And I want to say that first, when I was asked by my dear friend, Robert Hewitt, if I would present for this forum, I was like, sure, no problem. So I was like, I was going to repurpose this other presentation I did on the purple line and gentrification research I've been doing. Something was pulling me in another direction. So, you know, I'm going to do something else. And it's good because I think we do have a presentation on that. And so now you have to hear something else, like 2 presentations on purple lines. But in any case, what I'm going to talk about today is called Social Justice and the story of Humboldt Parkway. The reason why I picked this is because the story takes place in Buffalo, New York, my hometown where I was born and raised. And so it means quite a bit to me. And so I thought, you know what, let me talk about this. Let me put this presentation together to kind of talk about the story that brings together a lot of the concepts that this forum represents today. So before I get started, I wanted to show this quote that I thought was really, really kind of just really put an impact on kind of like the whole essence of what I'm going to be talking about today. And this quote is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I thought it was really important, especially this part right here, where it says, you know, Americans should enjoy easy access to the cities via the automobile and live in suburbs without Black people, who by their very nature degrade property and humanity. And that represents a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to do is I want to show you a very clip note version, almost of what the presentation is going to be about. Hopefully you won't leave after the clip note version and get the rest of it. But I thought this is something that's going to tie everything together and kind of get us started. So the story of Buffalo's emerald necklace begins nearly 200 years ago in 1868, when we had the design of the Olmsted Park system. And now this was the period where Frederick Law Olmsted, he had just 10 years prior, you know, put together a design with his partner, Howard Boggs in Central Park. And he designed it, and there's a lot of fanfare, it was beautiful. And so this is now 10 years later. And so he's like the most well-known landscape architecture in the country, and everyone wants to get him, you know, get his opinion. Meanwhile, for those 10 years, he kind of was just like doing random stuff. I think he did some stuff with the war. He went to a little out west for the gold rush. But his partner, Calvin, was like, look, you got to get back into the landscape architecture. You do this really well. You need to get back to it. So he was on his way back to New York City, and he stopped in Buffalo. And so there were some folks, some of the planners, you know what, let's take you around because we want to have our own little Buffalo Central. So he was taken around to different places to scout with. And at this point, Buffalo was the 10th largest city in the United States. And so after this visit, Olmsted actually put up some plans, but he came back and he basically quoted, said, Buffalo is the best planned city in the United States. And he proposed kind of this whole multi-use mixed parks and parkways that would create this emerald necklace. And so between 1868 and 1896, him and Halbert designed what would be this whole emerald necklace or the park system. And what was interesting is Buffalo now, even today, it has been designed based on the initial Joseph Eliot's radio system and how it's a planned city, but also the structures from this Olmsted Park system, and then obviously its position to Lake Erie and Niagara River. And so what we have here is three main parks that were the beginning of the actual system. And the first one was Delaware Park. So Delaware Park was the largest, and this is the one where, you know, the whole pastoral aspect and themes of Olmsted really was coming through. This park was mostly completed in 1876. And there's this part right here, this middle part is called a meadow, and that's roughly about 150 acres. And this was supposed to have like these really aesthetic and pleasing types of features. Next, we have the front, and we really believe that because this park was kind of in what was kind of a rural, unpopulated area, we wanted to make sure there was something close to the waterfront. So this one is called the front. It's still actually called Front Park today. And so we really believe that this is something that should also be as part of the system. Next, we have the parade. So the parade was really closer to where folks were living within Buffalo, which is now called the MLK Park today. And we wanted to make sure that this park, which actually is called the parade, was like intended for like these drilling, military drillings and parades. And then there was also an area where people could get food and drink. There was a play area for kids. So it was really an actual parade. Years later, like 1896, his sons actually redesigned it. And so there was like a new layout that had like a water fountain, which actually they reinstituted again a few years ago in MLK. But there was also a wading pool. And so these are the three main parts of the actual system. And so looking at this larger map, which you see three parts that I just described, you have this kind of ideal, this picturesque kind of situation. And the thing about it is you have also Humboldt Parkway, because you wanted to have parks within parks to connect. So Humboldt Parkway connects the park to the parade. And then over here, you have three more, Lincoln, Bidwell, and Chapin Parkway. But what's interesting to note is that Buffalo, this part was never completed. Buffalo is divided by segregation, residential segregation by Main Street. You have your west side and you have your east side. And even this contemporary segregation goes even back to World War I. And basically what happened and how it became so segregated is like three things. So you have World War I. And so a lot of the white workers, they needed to leave. They needed to go to the war. Meanwhile, the factories, and a lot of factories were using water power. This was a really city, for a lot of like factory use. They were like, we need workers and we need to still produce items for the war. So number two, you had the Great Migration. A bunch of Black folks, Black men specifically, were leaving Jim Crow South. They needed to go up, and find some jobs. And so they were going up north. And then third, you had a lot of existing white folks who were like, we don't want to live next to the Black migrants. So basically they did some tactics, many different tactics, so that the Black Americans, instead of the Black migrants, were in segregated areas. And so fast forward to actually the next war. So we have suburbanization that is now occurring even more so. So you had the end of World War II, we got some excess money, the soldiers come home, they're happy, they get home with their sweethearts, there's a baby boom, a whole lot of babies being born during this time, still the largest in generation. So they're like happy, the war's over. We also got some GI Bills. So now I can go to trade school, I can go to college, and also importantly, I can buy a brand new house for my brand new bride. So I got some extra money also because, there's a lot of stimulation of the economy. I can consumer items, TV, but you know what, if I'm going to live in the suburbs, mind the fact that GI Bill was really to get a house in the suburb. How am I going to get there? I need to buy a car. And when I'm gone, my wife needs a car so she can pick up the kids from school. So I'm going to get from the downtown city to my suburbs really quickly. How about some highways? So let me go back to this first. When we're thinking about segregation, and I see the same Main Street. You see right now, currently, if you're a Black American person living in Buffalo, 85% likelihood of living east of Main Street. And that is still today, and that was the case even decades ago. And as you can see over here, very unlikely. There's some areas where it's only about 6%. So I just wanted to make sure you saw the distinct segregation. But let me go back to what I was talking about before. So we need the highways. Now, the whole idea with the highway is very interesting because the federal government, state government, was like, we're going to have to pay for this. Coupled with this whole idea of urban renewal. And so within Buffalo and many other cities, there were many tactics to create residential segregation. Redlining, which you've all heard about, blockbusting, covenants, but specifically when I'm talking about these highways, I'm talking about this urban renewal. And so what happened was you had a lot of planners thinking, you know what, if we go in these urban areas that are like, broken down, what we can do is we can put an interstate right there. And so they were like, well, where are we going to build it? So because of the kind of residential segregation I told you about, they thought Humboldt Parkway would be the best location. And so when it was just stated that we were going to get this new interstate highway, it was thought this was going to be a new era for the city. And everyone was just like super excited. Well, not everyone, but many people were super excited. So finally, in order to get this new expressway, you had to destroy Humboldt Parkway. It was a 25-year project that destroyed the parkway. As you can see, that was originally tree-lined streets, beautiful, going all the way from here up to Delaware Park. It further isolated the Black community on the east side, and obviously devastated the green space loss. Next, we had to actually, and I wanted to show you an example of this during the construction process in 1950. So when you had the Humboldt Parkway, see how beautiful it is with the trees and the houses. This is the neighborhood deli. This is that same neighborhood deli during the construction where they just completely obliterated and took out all of the trees from the parkway. So now you got to do the expressway. So it's a depressed expressway. It goes under, you can see the same houses. So now the houses are like right up on the expressway. Now, some of the push figures for this was, it's going to connect everybody in the city. So that's why this is going to be a great way to have Kensington Expressway. Next, they were like, we need to do revenue for the next war. So in order to evacuate everybody real quick, we need expressway because we still had that kind of Cold War era preparedness. The fact is that is most rational really is the fact that there were more and more cars coming. Because remember, this is suburbanization. And during this time, by 1960, about 80%, no, 60% of cars, and there's a one household car. By the 80s, it was 2. So you're getting more and more cars. And so you can see that it can increase by 40% during those 6 years. Finally, we had it. And they said, you know what, folks, we're going to just move you. So New York State displaced over 600 families in order to build this expressway that you see. This is current day picture, and that was what it was before the parkway. And they said, you know what, don't worry about it. I'm gonna put you in some public housing, which is this Kensington Heights public housing. So you were somebody who originally had a single family home, could look out, see these beautiful trees, but now you have this public housing, and now you look out and see a highway. Just to let you, one more last slide to show you, this is where that Kensington Public Heights highway is. This is in reference to the Tops massacre from last May. So you can see it's only about 1.5. And this again is the east side of Main Street, where it's like a food desert and everything. So it's very depleted as a result of the highway that has come in. And so restoration. Some people are happy, some people are not. This is kind of the plan that they're thinking about, having some replacement bridges, some ventilation structures, but it's only for 3/4 of it. So it's not the whole thing. And so this is the last little thing I want to show you, because some people are for it and some people are not.
Sorry about that.
And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Nick Finia. As you'll see in the presentation guide, we have a mix of both School of Public Health and the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation researchers and practitioners presenting today. So there'll be a good mix of topics, and we're really interested in interdisciplinary, what projects may come in the future. So hopefully you'll be looking at these presentations and thinking about that. At the end of the set, this one has 4, we'll do questions and answers with the presenters who presented before.
Thanks, Tara. Do you need to fix that Zoom thing?
I think it's fixed.
Okay.
It seems to be still going.
Great. Well, hey, everyone. I'm Nick Pinio. I'm an assistant research professor in the School of Architecture, and I'm the associate director of the National Center for Smart Growth, which is a research center here in the school. And I also spent a lot of my time supporting the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which I'll talk about a little bit more as I go through the slides. And today in my presentation, can you click on that?
Sorry about that.
Yep. As I go through my presentation, I'm sort of going to be talking about my current research agenda as it relates to the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, but also things that I'm working on myself. So to start, the Purple Line. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years, you've probably heard about the Purple Line. Of course, we can see evidence of its construction all across our campus, ranging from the parking lots over here, right down across the middle of campus over to Route 1. And if you're unfamiliar with the Purple Line, you should know that it's a light rail line that's being built to connect Bethesda and the western part of our region over to New Carrollton on the other side of campus, going straight through communities like Silver Spring, Langley Park, College Park, and Riverdale. And it will connect directly to the metro system in Silver Spring, College Park, and New Carrollton. And one thing that I think is important to note when we talk about the Purple Line is that its alignment is traveling through some of the poorest and most exclusive regions together in a very short area. So we have places like Bethesda and Chevy Chase, which are very expensive, very exclusive. Then you get into areas like Langley Park and Riverdale on either side of campus, where we have some of the most affordable housing in the entire region inside the Beltway. So I constantly have to update my slides, and I don't think I did this one. We were expected to open the Purple Line in 2026. Now it's looking like 2027. I think I got that right later. As you've heard, these construction delays keep piling up. That's unfortunately common with all major infrastructure projects. So current research questions, what we're wrestling with here at the Center for Smart Growth and in the Purple Line Corridor Coalition. So the Purple Line isn't open yet, and it's not going to be open for another 3, 4, maybe even 5 years. But one thing that I'm interested in is the Purple Line corridor already gentrifying? You've heard about gentrification in the Washington, D.C. region if you've lived here for a month or if you've lived here for 20 years. So I want to know if this part of the suburbs that the line is going through, even before it opens, is gentrifying or not. And if that's happening, how is it impacting people who live here, and how is it impacting businesses that are located in these communities? Are people forced to move elsewhere, further away, cheaper neighborhoods because they can't afford rising costs? And then last, I want to investigate what local government can do to support residents and businesses so they can stay here and thrive once the transit line opens, even though that does seem to be far off. So sorry for the really tiny font here, but that's okay, because you can just listen to me. I'm going to go through a couple of things, talking about past research that I've done and then future research that I'm going to do. One thing is I've looked at gentrification as it relates to the closure of businesses in the Purple Line corridor. And then I have a couple of research grants coming up. One is with the Urban Institute and the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, and they want to publish a guide for how state transportation agencies can mitigate gentrification as it occurs due to investment in transportation. And we want to use the Purple Line as a case study because we have the activities of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, particularly in the area of supporting small business and affordable housing. So we want to add that as a case study to that study guide. And then also I'm part of a project through a research grant at Howard University, which is funded by HUD. And I'm assessing how gentrification is impacting people in the area with that grant. And then the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which if you haven't heard of us, you should Google it and check out our website. But my boss, Garrett Knapp, founded the Purple Line Corridor Coalition 10 years ago now. And what we are doing is making sure that once the transit line opens, the communities that live and work around the corridor have an equitable place to be, and they can stay once the corridor opens. And we're doing that through support for businesses, support for affordable housing, and support for the local workforce. And the Purple Line Corridor Coalition is funded to do a few things: advance construction of affordable housing, and also improve safety and access to the Purple Line. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So tiny map, but I know Tara is going to share the slides so that you all can access them later. So this is some research that's currently under review at a journal, but this is a map of gentrifying communities in the Purple Line corridor. And you can see the tracks. I can't really point at that with this, but that's fine. The dark blue ones here are places that I say in my research have gentrified in the past 20 years. Those are communities like Silver Spring, parts of Tacoma Park, and parts of Hyattsville. And when you talk about gentrification, there's a lot of different definitions of gentrification, but I think it's a general agreement that gentrification means people with higher levels of education and higher incomes coming into a neighborhood. When that happens, you see incomes rise, you see home prices increase, you see household incomes increase. And in these blue areas on the map, in the past 20 years, we saw real rents go up $500, $600 after adjusting for inflation. You had 1 out of 3 people had a bachelor's degree 20 years ago. Now it's 2 out of 3 people. Real home values have doubled. So they've become much more exclusive. So those are the blue neighborhoods. These dark gray places are places that have not gentrified yet. So those places aren't seeing that big jump in education levels. They aren't seeing that big jump in income. So what my research is focused on is figuring out, are these places like Langley Park, like Riverdale, going to gentrify before the Purple Line opens? How can we mitigate that gentrification so people aren't displaced in the 2020s and 2030s once the Purple Line gets here? Another tiny chart here, but just teasing some other research because I don't have time to go through the technical details. I did an analysis of businesses in the Purple Line corridor in my dissertation, and I wanted to ask 2 questions. If a business is close to the Purple Line's construction, does that make it more likely to close? And also, if a business is in a gentrifying neighborhood, does that make it more likely to close for a few reasons, right? So if a business is near where the Purple Line is being built, it may be hard to get to it. Construction might be getting in the way. If the neighborhood is gentrifying, there might be increased rents for these businesses. They might be seeing demographic change and new customers. So I found some limited statistical evidence that yes, these things are true. Businesses that are close to the Purple Line and are in gentrifying neighborhoods are slightly more likely to close, to have their businesses fail, than businesses that are further away. I'm going to be continuing to investigate that through some upcoming research. But back to displacement for a minute here. So it's actually, believe it or not, a pretty big debate in the gentrification literature as to what happens to neighborhoods once they gentrify or while they're gentrifying. There are a lot of papers out there. A lot of people argue that over long periods of time, when you look at cities or certain neighborhoods, when they gentrify, low-income people actually, on average, on net, can stay in that place. And there's a very vibrant debate over this. There's a lot of people who say that no, that doesn't happen that way. You see big drops in low-income people. People have to move far away. They can't afford their neighborhoods anymore. So I want to look at this at a local level in the Purple Line corridor. And here in the back, you probably can't see the numbers, but this is just some data from the census, a really quick accounting of displacement, right? You count up households by their level of income, which I have here. So these are lower income people. These are higher income people. In the Purple Line corridor in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a big drop, about 7,000 or 8,000 fewer households making less than $75,000 a year. Simultaneously, a big increase in the number of households making more than $150,000 a year. So I think this displacement is happening, but I need better data to prove it. And so for this work with Howard University and the NCHRP and the Urban Institute, I want to get data from a company called Data Axle, which is a little creepy because they have data on all of us. They know who we are, they know where we've lived for the past 15 years. From things like when you change your address, when you change your utilities, credit applications, things like that. So I want to get this data set of households and be able to track where they live, where they've been over time. So I can see if people in the Purple Line corridor have to move further away to Wheaton or Laurel, places like that. And I want to know people who are coming to the corridor, where are they coming from? Are they coming from downtown? Are they coming from New York, wherever? So that's what I'm working on right now. And I also want to support this work with qualitative evidence. So I'm working with a local community group in Long Branch, which is a neighborhood near where I live in Montgomery County, in between Silver Spring and Langley Park. And I want to conduct some focus groups with residents there with support from CHEER to get perspectives from people who live in these neighborhoods are going to get Purple Line stations. Well, what do you think about the Purple Line coming? Is it going to change your neighborhood? Is gentrification something that you think about, that you worry about? Have you been evicted? Have you had to leave? Is your rent going up? Questions like that. So that's going to be happening this spring. And then back to the PLCC. So here I'm part of a much bigger team on some of these projects. But we recently got awarded a grant from the FTA to advance safe access to the Purple Line stations, retrofitting suburban strip malls for affordable housing, TOD. If you drive University Boulevard or if you drive to Riverdale, you don't really think that this is a place where a railroad is going to come, right? It looks like any strip mall in the United States. We're going to be doing a lot of work figuring out how to make these places safer and more comfortable to walk and a more comfortable place to get on the train, while also thinking about how not to displace the people and the businesses who are already there. So that's a brief overview of everything that I do. I'm happy to turn it over to the next person.
So the next team, Rachel Rosenberg-Goldstein and Priscilla Oliver, is an interdisciplinary team. Marcus Hendricks is a part of this team. He's not here today, but we're really pleased to have them present. You've got the clicker, you're all set to go.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to be here to present this joint project between My WOW Lab, which stands for Water Quality Outreach and Wellness, and the Surge Lab, which stands for Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab. Again, my name is Rachel Rosenberg-Goldstein. I'm from the School of Public Health, and I'm here with my colleague, Priscilla Alves, who's from the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. So today we'll be talking about combining environmental health assessments with infrastructure planning and participatory research to evaluate risks from sanitary sewer overflows and basement backups. So we know that antimicrobial resistant infections are one of the leading causes of death worldwide. We also know that these types of infections are expected to increase, and over time, by 2050, antimicrobial resistant infections will become the leading cause of death worldwide. One of these causes of antimicrobial resistant infections is a specific type of bacteria called methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. And in the United States, MRSA causes around 20,000 deaths per year. Traditionally, MRSA and other antibiotic-resistant bacteria were really thought to be mostly from healthcare and hospital-associated settings. But what we've learned over the past about decade and a half is that in fact, there's many environmental sources of these types of bacteria, including from the built environment. And we know from some of my work that one of these environments is from wastewater treatment plants. And what we found in some of my work is that we identified MRSA from 4 US wastewater treatment plants in about 50% of our samples, including 83% of the raw incoming sewage. What we know less about is whether antibiotic-resistant bacteria are present in non-point sources of pollution. And this includes things like sanitary sewer overflows. These are also called SSOs, and they're the unregulated release of untreated sewage from municipal sewer systems. And there's about 75,000 SSOs that happen per year in the United States.
Thank you, Rich. So in this context, we can see that the sewage overflow events, they don't happen only here, but actually around the world in many cities. When we are dealing with the United States, there are some cities that have more the sewage overflow events, and one of that is in Baltimore. So our project is inside Baltimore, and Baltimore is the second largest city in Maryland, has I think around 600,000 residents. And from this map here, you can see some of the locations of the sewage overflow events from 2017 until 2019, and you can see lots of points here with the location of the basement backups. According to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, so we had since 2011, 3,900 individual sewage overflow events in the cities. Just to give you a little bit of context of people from Baltimore is facing. Yeah, so our project deals with the sewage overflow events and environmental justice in two main perspectives. The first one is about the quality of life, and the second one about health. So we are doing some engagement strategies that I'm going to show you a little bit about this after this slide, where we try to understand the previous experience with the sewage overflow events of the people of Baltimore, and also the impacts to the properties, but also mental health, and of course, investigating waterborne diseases in the sewage overflow events, samples that we are taking from the houses. So this is the link with MRSA and also other diseases that we are investigating with the sewage overflow events. The main goal of the project is to understand the awareness and experience of the residents with the sewage overflow events. And as I said, we are doing some engagement strategies with some of the residents of the cities. So we did some interviews with the policymakers. This is the first phase. And we also applied some surveys with the residents. And the next part is to collect some of the samples. So we kind of prepared a sample collection guide, as you can see here, where we have a lot of steps and people can collect themselves, or we can support them in taking some surface samples and also some water samples from the basement. So if they have the sewage overflow event now, we can take some water samples from there to try to analyze a little bit of the sewage. This is also one of the flyers that we had, and we gave to the people, just distributing and making them aware of our project. As I said, we have the process of engagement and collaboration, 7 phases from preparation. So this is a huge collaboration, if I can say like that, because we need the community leaders to help us. We have our team here in the search lab and also the rule lab, and we also have the collaboration with some agencies from Baltimore. So we are having all of these meetings, if I can say like that, to try to organize everything. And we did, so until now, we did 30 interviews with the policymakers, which were held online because of the COVID restrictions. We collected 40 surveys in 2 communities of Baltimore. And in the same communities that we are applying the surveys, we also collected the surface and water samples from their properties. So 40 surface samples and 6 water samples. So in 6 properties, when we applied the survey, they actually had some sewage in the basement. So we could collect the samples and also analyze it in the lab. We did the lab testing, and we're going to show part of the results for you. It's still some preliminary findings that we have in the project. And now we are somewhere between analysis and reporting back. We actually reported back the results for the communities, but we still have some of the things that we want to do in the future with them. These are just some photos of the participatory approach. We did it in 4 days during summer, so community A and community B, and all of them, as I said, they had the sewage overflow events in the past, and they also showed a lot of vulnerability. So they have the infrastructure, but the infrastructure doesn't have a good maintenance, if I can say like that. So they have a lot of problems with the public infrastructure and also their own infrastructure inside their homes. And most of the 2 communities, they are predominantly African-American community, both of them they are, and we could see this very clear when we were applying these surveys. We are still analyzing all of the data sets together, but we do have some of the results that we had with the surveys, and I know this is a lot of graphs. I don't want to go in the graphs, but one thing that's very important, this is the report card that we sent to the community, showing up a little bit of the results that we had. And one thing that's very important is that even though they have the problem with the sewage overflow events, not always they consider the infrastructure as bad. So actually, when we were putting the data together, we saw that it's almost 50 and 50% of the people, some of them, they consider the infrastructure as good. And the other half of the residents, they say, no, it's terrible, it's very poor, it's poor. So we are trying to understand this. And of course, 70% of the residents, they did so any type of cleanup or remediation in the basements, which is very interesting with our results. So, Rachel.
Thank you. And so from the bacteria side, these are some of our preliminary results. So again, only 6 homes had actual standing water to sample. From those 6 homes, half of the water samples had E. coli present, which is an indicator of fecal contamination. 1 sample did have MRSA present, so again, this antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And 1 sample had another type of important hospital-associated infectious bacteria present, coagulase negative staphylococcus or cons. When we looked at our 40 surface samples, here we saw about 20% of our samples had E. coli present, again, this indicator of fecal contamination. And although we didn't find any MRSA here, we did find another type of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And the concern here is that there could be gene transfer between some of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria and other bacteria that are present. So taking our project overall, we think that this is very important. As far as we know, we're the first study to ever identify antibiotic-resistant bacteria in these sanitary sewer overflows. Also knowing that these same communities, which are largely Black and African American and already disenfranchised, are also the same communities which are overwhelmingly experiencing sanitary sewer overflows and disproportionately more of these antibiotic-resistant infections. We think that these types of events could be potential exposure risks for these communities. For us as a team, our next steps are we're going to go back to the communities, we're going to share the results, we're going to also share resources and explain what are some appropriate cleanup techniques. Our goal is to also expand our sample collection sites so that we can see, is this just happening in these 2 communities or a broader issue? And then because we only identified 6 homes that had the standing water, even though the majority of the homes had experienced these events within the past month, we know that we need to be able to respond more rapidly when these events occur. And then our goal is also to incorporate some more different variables into our analysis. So things like infrastructure information, spatial analysis, and also social variables. So we can't have this presentation without thanking our amazing team, including the amazing Dr. Marcus Hendricks, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, all of our students, our labs, and then thank you all for this.
Coming up, excellent. This is the last presenter for this set, and directly after this, we're going to do a facilitated question and answer session. If there's anyone in the back who wants to seat up from our couple of seats up here. Thank you. There are 2 slides here. Oh, sorry.
Well, welcome everybody. While that's getting set up, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Stephen Wolke. I am a postdoctoral associate in the historic preservation program here. I got my PhD in the anthropology program. My background is in historical archaeology and digital heritage preservation. And I'm going to be talking about work I've been doing the last couple of years in North Brentwood, which we were trying to get started right as COVID picked up. So it got delayed a little bit. But we'll be talking again about the legacy of intersecting forces on the built environment, and actually brings together a lot of the things that have been brought up today. Like the quote that we started with in Jennifer Roberts' presentation on Ta-Nehisi Coates, none of these things are an accident. The experiences of people in North Brentwood over generations was really part of structures, legal and otherwise, that were put in place that the community is still living with the consequences of. And so that includes segregated housing practices, racially restricted housing covenants, which a student of mine, Dr. Mohammadi, wrote a report on as part of the House project last year. That's on drum if anybody wants to go take a look at that. And environmental racism, especially related to floodwater and stormwater backflows, sewage backflows. So, quick brief history of North Brentwood. It goes back to actually an officer from the U.S. Colored Troops, white man, named Captain Wallace Bartlett, who got together with some other land speculators and bought land next to a development called Highland, which is now where Bladenburg is located. And this section of land got called the Highland Addition, and part of it is today part of Brentwood, and the rest of it is part of North Brentwood, which is the historically Black community we're going to be talking about today. The first African Americans to purchase land here were part of the Randall family. Henry Randall was an African American man from Anne Arundel County. Through family, brother-in-law of his actually served under Captain Bartlett. And we think that's part of how he was able to end up purchasing land in this area. But the main reason he was allowed to purchase land here was because no white people had bought any land in this area for 4 years as he had tried to sell it. And that's because it wasn't a low-lying floodplain. Now, on the left here, can't quite see it, but this is the Henry Randall house here. So this was the very first house built in what is today known as North Brentwood. This is the Peter Randall house next door. The Peter Randall house is still standing. That was built the following year. Peter Randall was one of Henry's sons. And interestingly, Henry's wife Isabella was from the White Marsh plantation on the border of Prince George's in Arundel County, which was one of the Jesuit plantations. And her parents and grandparents were actually sold as part of the deal to bail Georgetown University out of debt. So tomorrow we have the 1856 symposium here, or 1856 project symposium. And here, not only do we have connections to the University of Maryland through the community members that have worked here over generations, but also to the history of enslavement at other local universities through the Randall family. So after the Randalls built their first home, some other family members started to move in. You started to have some community infrastructure built. The first schoolhouse was a one-room schoolhouse built in 1904. Later, 20 years later, Rosenwald School was built here. We had the first churches being built, including North Brentwood AME Zion Church, which you see pictured here. And this was actually made possible, again, because of a white justice of the peace who lived in Brentwood. This was outside of the area where any Black residents had owned land. He actually purchased this land to sell it to the congregation. So time and again, you see the way in which the struggles of these Black communities have been impacted by white actions, whether those are pro-segregation actions or as allies working to support members of the community. And the fact that this church still stands here today and is a vibrant part of the community is a good example of that. The town of North Brentwood was actually incorporated in 1924. This is 2 years after the town of Brentwood was incorporated. But they actually tried to incorporate Brentwood a few years earlier. But it was voted down by the residents because it included parts of North Brentwood and they wanted to have an exclusively white community. So they restructured the municipalities and boundaries. And so in 1922, Brentwood was incorporated. And 2 years later, that meant that North Brentwood was able to be incorporated. And that effort was really led by Jeremiah Hawkins, who became the first mayor of North Brentwood. And this was during a really big time of growth for North Brentwood, which really continued up until the end of World War II. And at that time, North Brentwood had already experienced many devastating floods. Huge parts of the community have been destroyed at various times. And that's because they're right on the banks of the North Branch of the Anacostia River. Finally, in the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers built a levee and this pump house that you see pictured here. And it is an effective mitigation strategy. It does prevent flooding, sewage backflows during flood events when the pump house works. And every few years, the pump house fails and the community has to essentially relive this nightmare over and over and over again. But that's not the only risk to the community and its preservation today. We also heard about gentrification in the Purple Line talk from Nicothenia. And community members are really worried about the impacts of gentrification. You are seeing property values increasing dramatically. they're a little more resilient because they are still governed by the descendants of the town's founders. So you have an all-black council and mayor, multi-generational residents of North Brentwood who have control over the way in which these communities are changing. And that's one of the interesting things about the North Brentwood example is the way gentrification happens when a community controls the way in which it's changing is very different than the way Black and brown communities are impacted in communities where they don't have any self-governance. And so North Brentwood is a really important case study in that sense of how to manage gentrification over time. Community members actually stopped some of my students while they were doing some surveying and mapping work because they were worried that they were surveying for a new development in the middle of town. And so they were able to kind of explain what they were doing. But it is definitely a concern of community members in North Brentwood. So what have we been doing? We've actually been working with community members to select sites to digitally document and preserve. This started with support from a small grant from the Anacostia Trails Heritage Area, which is the local state heritage area here in northern Prince George's County, and was further supported by a New Directions grant from the Catalyst Fund, where we were able to kind of purchase the last of the equipment we needed for really full documentation, high resolution documentation of the community. So here you see an example of the juke joint in town. So this is Tavern, as well as something that would otherwise be a very mundane object if you knew nothing about it, the Wyndham Road barrier here. But this was actually a barrier put up in the 50s to block access between North Brentwood and Brentwood. So here we have something mundane, but it's a physical example of efforts to segregate and divide these communities. Today, the demographics, of course, are very different, but this barrier is going to be removed, not to provide access, but to create a memorial space. So there's been artists working on this for a number of years now. A sculpture will start to be installed later this year that will actually incorporate part of this barrier, but we were able to document that landscape to sort of preserve it for the future within a digital environment. So one of the things that's great about digital preservation is the community is still allowed to change and modify their landscape. They're not impacted by restrictions, easements, and things that typically come along with historic preservation. They're still able to modify their landscape, but at the same time, preserve the way things were at different points in the past to tell stories about their history so that future generations don't forget. And as we did this work, we were able to work with the Department of Anthropology here to run an archaeological field school last year, where we started excavating at the Henry Randall site. The house is no longer standing, it burned down in the 90s, but the archaeology is still very much intact. So we've been able to start to recover some of the archaeological evidence of what that family was doing when they were first moving in and making Randalltown a town, really the foundation of what today is North Brentwood. And then more recently, from the Arts for All campaign, we got an arts amplification grant, Quint Gregory and I, to teach a course focused on community-centered digital heritage interpretation. And so through that class, we are working with students and community members to sort of add value to the documentation. These digital models are pretty, but they don't really provide much value to the community alone. So we are working now to sort of inventory all of the historical information, oral histories the town's collected over decades, so that we can start to pull from that to add some stories, some historic documents, historic images to a digital environment that features these spaces to really empower the community to tell the stories that are important to them, to share them with the larger North Brentwood diaspora as people from the community have moved across the country and around the world, but also to tell their stories to other communities and other people who can really benefit from seeing the impacts of self-governance on how the community has been able to survive throughout these generations. So as we look to the future, these are some of the things we're hoping to do is expand our documentation to essentially a full digital twin of North Brentwood, a high resolution 3D map or 3D model of the community And with that, I've spoken with Priscilla and Marcus about using some of that high resolution data to do some stormwater modeling, because that is still the greatest fear of community members. Pretty much every time you go to a town council meeting, community members show up to talk about the impacts of flooding, to talk about the impacts of sewage in their basement. This is something that they're still living with, week by week, month to month. And lastly, to continue building communities, whether that's within North Brentwood, which now is about just under half Spanish-speaking community, or between communities, because all around our campus, we have these historically Black communities that are connected to one another through their own histories, as well as building community between the University of Maryland and North Brentwood and these other historically Black. This is not something that is ever a process that's completed. It's something we work on over time. It takes a long time to build trust, especially in a lot of these communities where there's a lot of distrust of the university. But we are working to really use our resources here, use our students to give back and support those communities, empower them to tell the stories about their past that they want to tell. And so I just want to thank everybody that's been a part of making this possible over the last few years, whether that's here at the School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning, Arts and Humanities, Behavioral and Social Sciences, also Roger Eastman, Immersive Media Design, whose name I didn't quite get up on here, but especially the students who have really made this possible, including Justin Mohammadi, Olivia Mayoni, Reese Burns, who's doing a spin-off project right now to digitally recreate the Henry Rangel House based on archaeological, documentary, and oral historical evidence, so we can understand how it was built and how it changed over time. And hopefully a new student, Amir, who I invited to come today to see this, is going to be helping develop some of those digital interpretation tools that I mentioned earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 groups of speakers. Any questions right off the bat?
Here to answer questions. I'm here to distribute questions. If I could just comment, wow, what a fabulous set of presentations, I have to say. I mean, who would know that there were 2 separate colleges or schools here? You couldn't tell, I think, who was going to be there. So I thought that was really quite fabulous. So I hope we do more things like this. So I want to credit the 2 deans for putting this on. And now, having said that, I welcome you to answer questions at any of our presenters. Yeah.
So I think this question for the first presenter and the last presenter together. Both of you showed land use decisions that were made in the past that really hurt people, whether it's a barrier in the neighborhood to keep people out, or this tunneled highway through a neighborhood. And you talked about efforts being made by the city to remove the barrier and to redo part of the landscape, a little piece of the landscape in Buffalo. But I guess my question is, those are small tokens in a direction. How do we as planners and public health professionals work in a way to make sure that those changes are meaningful and they're not just tokens of something else? The 2 of you want to respond.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
So I think key to doing that is really listening. I think that's kind of the #1 task of doing any sort of community-based work. So people in the community really like to see the work we've done so far. There were some people that stopped by our site every single day that we excavated. We got to know pretty well. But when you talk about the things that are going to impact their lives the most, it's really the things like that. So they want to preserve this heritage, because there could be a flood that comes next week that literally wipes North Brentwood off. That is their #1. But through listening to the community, we can start to identify what the real issues that need to be addressed are. And then we can start to work on finding solutions. And so that's where my discussions with Marcus and Priscilla have really been focused, is trying to find some funding sources really to do the research and on modeling to help the town figure out what strategies they can pursue. They know they have a problem. And they know there are possible solutions out there, but they don't know which of those possible solutions might actually solve the problem that they have. So it can only be done through, the long-term and through open, honest conversation and hard work.
I would also agree that, with the listening, but I also think, looking at the reality of the situation. And knowing, there's only so much that can be remedied. And so more so to tone, in terms of the damage that was done, and it should be respect the profound aspect of the damage. And so I would say, really, it's clever to make sure that it doesn't happen again, but also to understand a very multi and interdisciplinary aspect. So this highway, I didn't talk about the air pollution, but the air pollution is profound. There's some residents who said so many members of their family along it's called 33, for short, who died of cancer. There's a high average. So an interdisciplinary aspect of working with public health, or working with people of other disciplines, to really see, so you're not looking at this isolation, like, oh, why are these people having high levels of this? Oh, there it is, this 33. And so really making sure that it happens again, because I think that's the key, because it's so easy. It's so easy. And when we're talking about residents don't have a voice, don't have power. I think in this situation, many didn't have power. And so I think that's why there's some people who are against the restoration projects. It looks like these are over few little trees that we use 3/4 of the cloud, the string has 33. You still have the residents who are going to be handling those tailback missions Saturday day. And so listening, atoning for, because you got it wrong. We thought we stopped. And that it makes sense, because a lot of residents actually were complaining back in the 50s. There's so many cars coming down my street. You're walking up there's a street, this little street like that, and so spraying people who come off the beltway because it's easy to get back onto Colesville. That's a quiet street. And so there's just too many cars. So I didn't think how they thought that was going to be a remedy. But also acknowledging that, why did we pick that way? We had many other options. We could have gone west, we could have done this. And so I think listening to the residents, being apologetic, atoning, and then saying, look, we
That's okay.
Jennifer, I'm wondering if while you're talking about that, I was curious to have you elaborate a bit on people not wanting to do the restoration project, and you touched on it a little bit at the end, but it sounds like maybe the argument is too little too late, or what are the arguments?
A little bit of it is a little too late. A little bit of that, a little bit of the project. I mean, I can show this quick thing, but it's really short, like 3/4, and like the 3/4 part is like really far from like the images that I showed where you saw that highway adjacent at a different section. So that, and then I think also, you have people who are who like it's an nostalgia that you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. Let's put down my mom. And it's funny that I'm doing this work because my mom was born in 1951. And so they started, the proposal was in 1946. They broke ground in 1956. So she had 6 years, technically, we used to walk to 4 years. But she said, I used to walk this with my brother and my sister up and down the road and walk all the way to my house. I loved it. So, and I used to hear her talk about it. But I was born with a second wish. I was all 33, and I just lived right there. And so I think people like that's what I see. So you're not going to be you're too late. So how about this? Give me some medical attention. Give me some money for that. But I feel like this is an study. Don't just say, oh, it's fine. So I think there's other ways to make people whole, or not really whole, but kind of remedying it, but I think that's why there's a lot of folks who, sometimes see restoration.
Is there, like, similarly to some of the other conversations, like fear that this project when completed will bring gentrification essentially?
There was, there was some of that as well, because they had real pretty, like, so. And they'll pretty, so in that figure that I showed, there are some like bridges almost to go from east to west. So we're kind of way, they're like, okay, so we had this separate all these years, but now like, shoot. People coming from the west side, you want to see, oh, maybe I get a house cheaper. Oh, no, so there's that fear also of that gentrification. You're not even like opening up the door, so yes, there's also that fear as well. And it's sort of fear, like, I'm not getting it. It's going to be this like eyesore of a half-done project. So that's another.
Claire?
I was going to infer precisely the identification that I see also overlapping at least in 3 of the presentations. Then that the last in the list of racist policies that are affecting these communities. Stefan spoke that the North Brandon community has some control over managing what's happening with identification there, which I really trying to learn more about. And they need some expensive about that. So identification seems to be these ubiquitous dynamics that is, you know, that is at the forefront of new urban development that is establishing community of colors and low-income community. And it seems to be one that the 2 schools should pay attention to and could pay attention in collaborative ways. Say, for example, starting with the coach for gentrification and the different implications of it and what to do about it society to support these communities that are affected by the studios. And let alone, you know, collaborative research.
Other questions? Yes, so we have.
Yeah, hi, I think my question is mostly for Nicholas, but I don't know if anyone else wants to respond, which is, so College Park itself has like a big affordable housing problem, and the university itself is a developer and proposes projects. So I'm thinking of the Equitable project that was stopped last year, where affordable housing and like environmental needs were put in conflict with one another, and there was the university with it. It's like, well, you know, affordable housing, but you can have a lot of changes. So I just wanted to sort of ask in general, like, are there ways out of that kind of like, that's all, it feels like all, I don't know if that's true, but what can we ask of the university in its proposals for like addressing the problem of affordable housing in College Park now?
Yeah, that's the thorny one, and I learned from my boss that we stay out of backyard development debates as possible. People might remember weighing in on a faculty email thread about that development specifically, which became quite contentious because of the exact reason that you're talking about. And I don't think it's an illegitimate debate. And I think the Gilbert Woods project, especially, I mean, you take literally a parcel of woods in a place that has very little of that. In terms of the campus, is probably one of the worst places to do an argument for development. We have acres of parking lots, etc. I think what I would want to encourage the university to do and Prince George's County government to do, especially, is to include you know, housing for low income and moderate income people as a part of new development projects, which is not required in College Park or Prince George's County. It's something that through the Purple Line Corridor Coalition we've been trying to do. So, you know, not tearing down parks and build housing is probably a good place to start, and we have a lot of other places to do it more efficiently.
He's learned well to be invasive. It's just questions. Other questions? Yeah. Definitely.
I have a question. So important. I know, I'm not sure if I missed it, but the work that you're doing in Baltimore, is it like with the butterfly? Or like, are you able to compare like, I mean, I said like butterfly versus some of the other areas? Any differences or?
Yeah, actually, like, it's because like we have, our sample now is with 40 residents, and so 40 properties. But we do see that very clearly, like, most of the people like are Black American And when we are walking on the neighborhood again, and actually since we are working with the community associations, right? So they are also like saying, and this is, it's kind of a very similar discussion with everything that we've been talking about this afternoon. Because they are facing this sewage requirements. And this happens with the other social variables and infrastructure and all of that. And yeah, so we do see, yeah.
So this is also for Crystal, and I'm sorry, I forgot everything you were saying. Good to meet you. So participatory research is something I'm very interested in. I've always struggled a bit with how much you can ask of people, and also who, like, how successful. You know, it's always a risk going into this type of research. Who's going to engage? How many people are going to engage? You know, whether you're going to be able to get accurate reads on the community from those people. Could you talk a little bit about like tools that you use for engagement and how successful you think you were in that space? I'm just always interested to learn your projects.
Yeah, so this really is a community driven project. We are working just together with the community organizations, so Blue Water Baltimore, who works in Baltimore on many different water issues, but they actually helped us identify the communities to work with, and then they put us in touch with the community that's so we definitely did not want it to be researcher driven where we went and what we asked. And for now, we're doing this as a pilot project. So we work with the community members to develop a survey. They actually went out with us. So in those pictures that Priscilla showed, I mean, we would spend 8-hour days out with these older ladies from the neighborhood association would go with us door to door, so that it wasn't seen as something that we were doing to be attractive, but rather to provide information for communities. And at least as far as we forget, because as Priscilla mentioned, we have already given back results to those who didn't participate. All that we've heard is just gratitude that we're out there, that we're trying to help them answer questions. They're really not getting answered by the city.
Something that, like, I remember very clearly when we were there during the summer, and they were saying, oh, it's nice to meet you, because this is happening since forever, because I lived here for ages, and you are the first one that ever came here to my home to ask about the sewage overflow that I almost every year, you know, almost in all of the units. So, you know, again, everything is about the same. It's about listening, communicating, about trust, distrust, management, and gentrification, and all of that together. So we do think that the participatory approaches are a very good way of having this type of communication with them, listening to these type of things. They are, of course, entering the surveys, participating in workshops, or interviews. We have many times, but having this way, this type of communication, we do think that.
So just to follow, it sounds like the answer is that you found a community that was already, that had like an active interest in recruiting the research to.
Yeah, because they're people, yeah.
Did you find that there were components of people within the community who did this? Like, we talk about communities often as they're kind of like a unitary thing, but like, did you find that there were people who were resistant or who were disruptful? And
Well, they are, you always ask this, right? But I think in general, I don't know what to think, they are very open to the.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, definitely wasn't like 100% everywhere we knocked on, everyone wanted to let us see their owners, I think many of us, you know, something not that we're going to do that. Might not, but I think overwhelmingly, the participation rate was really high.
And you know, we have t-shirts and a lot of things, I did find that, okay, we have said that, we have all that. And I think this is probably as well, it is like the behaviors with us. So they were walking up to the degrees, and I don't know how many degrees was there, because so far, I can say that. And then were no, some of these tries to, and then I think trying to build the trust from the resident with us, and we're going to.
There's nothing better than having too many questions than we can handle, but that's where we're at. But now we have a networking session, which you can ask these questions directly, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. It's like a break. I know everyone's been sitting for quite a while. To get out, move around for a bit. I do really hope to come back during steps too. We have new researchers at campus. You've heard from some of them already. And our great collaborator at the School of Public Health, Robin Hewitt, is going to give more of a view of a number of different research tracks happening at the School of Public Health.
Don't forget about the money.
Yeah. So we'll start again.
Nice to meet you.
We should be good.
It's not working.
Sorry, again. There you go. Other one. Yeah. Other, yeah, need that. Great, sir.
Good afternoon. If you live in the city of Baltimore, unfortunately, this is a very familiar city. We see lots of vacant houses in Baltimore. As of February 2022, there have been there are about 15,000 vacant houses in Baltimore, and this number keeps growing almost every single day. So, in the beginning of pandemic, I had the opportunity of writing a proposal, an NIH proposal, and working on a project that was funded by NIH. And I was so blessed to work with an interdisciplinary team from electrical engineering to public health, psychology, architecture, and urban planning. And the whole goal of this project was very simple, because if we all remember the early days of pandemics when we could not move, our mobility was very limited, social distancing, and the fact that we didn't have access to public health amenities. What we came up with was that how can we utilize some of these buildings in order to use them and community clinics in the city of Baltimore. So, Jennifer, you already talked about, you read my mind, we talked about the black butterfly. This is a phenomenon that my former colleague, Lawrence, actually talks about. And this is actually the way that the city of Baltimore has been segregated like many other, unfortunately, many other American cities. And the fact that this gentrification is not just about the communities, it's also about resources. It's about accessibility to public health amenities, to healthy water that you mentioned, and so many other resources. So some of you might be familiar with the concept of community clinics. In the context of American architecture, community clinics became more and more popular after the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So that's why the majority of community clinics that you see in American neighborhoods were built in 70s and 80s. But unfortunately, that kind of changed. So the main reason that we started constructing many of these community clinics was because actually they address the needs of these communities, many of them being segregated, many of them being deprived of many of resources within their own neighborhoods. So the problem statement that we had for this project was very simple. How can we identify the most optimal location for these community clinics and turn the vacant buildings over there to community clinics? So, and the implications that that are there when it comes to So in other words, as you can see here, our goal is very simple because I have been fascinated by the concept of community clinic because many of these facilities, many of these communities, when you visit and you talk to the neighbors, you realize that these people, the same people, do not have access to Johns Hopkins Hospital that is just 10 minutes away from their house. So in other words, being close to a big hospital like the University of Maryland Hospital in Baltimore, or Mercy, or GBMC, or Johns Hopkins Hospital does not mean access to healthcare facilities and to healthcare. So for our project, we chose HEZ. HEZ is a health enterprise zone. So 5 zip codes in the city of Baltimore were recognized and were identified as kind of problematic zip codes by the state of Maryland. And that also happened in several other states. That was part of this bigger kind of national movement. And the state started kind of investing more on these communities and on these zip codes because they are the ones that are in immediate need of community health and attention. So that's why for my project, which was Health Enterprise Zone, 5 zip codes in the city of Baltimore. We had 3 main objectives. Number 1 was to identify the most optimal locations for these community clinics. The second one was to work with the community to get some response on social health, community health, mental health, and physical health. And number 3, to assess the feasibility of converting a vacant building into a community clinic. Because remember that you may have the building, but the building may not be prepared or may not have the potential to be converted into a community clinic. So for a specific aim that I'm not presenting here, we surveyed almost 365 people in HEZ, which was just an amazing achievement. And I should give a lot of credit to our community leaders and the community liaisons who ended up recruiting these people. And it's just amazing that when the number was not there, I tried to do this with my students, and it just simply did not work out. I mean, that day, we were just walking on, in one of these neighborhoods trying to collect surveys, and we were, I think after 6-7 hours, we just did 5 surveys. And it just tells you something, especially in the context of these cities, when it tells you something about this notion of trust, that these people have been surveyed, have been researched and studied by us as researchers for a long time, but because, and to some extent, they have lost their trust in the work that we do. Or sometimes we don't go back and present the results of the work that is being presented there. So specific aim 2 was actually mainly led by my colleague who's an electrical engineer, and we worked to come up with 2 different kind of indices to identify the most kind of optimal tracks, census tracks for these community clinics. And we came up with 2 models that were completely separate from each other. And I don't want to go into the details of this, but they have to do with health disparity indices that are out there. And but the interesting thing was that these 2 models both resulted in the same census tracts, so which kind of validated our findings there. So as you can see here, these are 5 tracts from these 5 zip codes that we identify as the most kind of problematic locations. So now our goal was just to map everything very carefully, all amenities, positive and negative, from bus stops to daycare facilities, restaurants, vacant lots, safe routes, schools, hospitals, in order to identify the best location for these buildings. And also, there were a series of other things that we needed to consider, like connectivity, like the location of the building and the proximity to other amenities like restaurants, like a grocery store and other things. And then we ended up identifying some kind of areas that were in need of attention. And based on this, we came up with 13 sites. So all of this work that I was talking about, which was done in almost 7-8 months, resulted in 13 sites because we surveyed almost every single vacant building that was located in these 5 tracts. And then this is where our urban planning / architectural research started. So this is the phase 3 of our project. So we went there and we surveyed each of these 13 buildings and we talked to the community members and we visited the building and we studied the elements of urban context. So as you can see here, there are these 3 main kind of tables that we created. One was accessibility, the other one was urban amenity, the third one is urban quality, and the fourth one is architectural quality. And each of them included and addressed a series of factors there. And based on this, we ended up choosing actually 3 sites as the most optimal ones in our project. So I think what I have learned throughout this project, and this is still ongoing, and by ongoing I mean we just finished our focus group interviews because in the beginning of pandemics we could not conduct the focus group interviews. It was really tough to recruit subjects and recruit participants for focus group interviews. That's why we came up with a more kind of creative idea. We thought now that the focus group interview is now going to be part of phase 1 of the project, now we can make it part of phase 3, so that it helps us validate what we have found in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of the project. And I think the most interesting part of this project has been actually working with communities and not having a top-down approach. It is always problematic, and especially in phase 1 when we ended up actually working with religious leaders, and they are the ones who announced our project in their churches and helped us recruit participants for the project. And the fact that this interdisciplinary work actually has opened our eyes that, you know, anything that we want to do really needs some multidisciplinary approach these days, that in order to come up with results that are kind of more thoughtful and more concrete, you need to work with experts in different fields. So because we don't have time, I'm just going to end it here, but I'll be happy to address your questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. And I said new researchers, but I meant we needed a researcher joining our team within the last year. Great, thank you.
Okay, well, that was actually a fairly good segue into something I'll loop back around toward the end of this presentation. Am I going the
Other
direction?
button,
Other
yeah.
direction.
Great.
Okay, great. So my name is Chester Harvey. I am new to the National Center for Smart Growth. I'm the new director of the Transportation Policy Research Group there. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about, sorry, habitually going the wrong direction. About research that I've been working on through my dissertation and carrying into the project here in Maryland. And a lot of this work for me has been around how to better bring together transportation and urban designers and ask sort of what is the traditional transportation field missing in the way that they approach transportation behavior, and I particularly like to think about walkers, who I think of as sort of the lowest common denominator in transportation. Everyone gets around in some way, even if that's by wheel and wheelchair in a pedestrian environment. And so one of the things that I've done a lot of work on is how to distinguish places that sort of might be more walkable in one sense, but are less walkable in others. And so going back to this example, transportation folks like to think of what's going on within the right of way or between the curbs. You know, can we put a sidewalk there or a bike lane, but often tend to sort of externalize the built environment spaces around the roadway. And then we also think about where people can get to, the sorts of destinations that you might be able to get to on foot. Walk score is a very popular metric for that. And so here are two places sort of within our sphere here in the DC area. One is by, I think it's now called the Mall at Prince George's. My wife grew up in Maryland, so she calls this Piggy Plaza, and that's how I think of it. But this is a place that, according to Walk Score, is a walker's paradise. It's scored 92. There's lots of places to get to. It's not a particularly inviting scale to walk in. It's a giant highway. The buildings are set really far back. You don't have a lot of sort of interaction with the built environment there. Compared to, for example, downtown Tacoma Park, it actually has a lower walk score, although margins are nearly the same. But architecturally, it's really a much more walkable environment. And so a lot of what I've tried to get at through my own research is how to factor that into our conception of walkability. These are qualitatively different. I would submit that they're also quantitatively different on a certain level. Research that's been done by a sort of NCSG alumnus, Reed Ewing, and many of his colleagues have identified these different factors of urban design that we, probably ought to be accounted for in the transportation space. So things like enclosure, human scale, the complexity of the design environment. And so my work gets into how can we account for these things in a systematic way over very large territories, in the same way that we can account for destination accessibility. So this is results from some of my research in the Bay Area where I did my dissertation. And I was actually able to show that behaviorally, people are more likely to walk in places that have things like storefronts along either side, that have trees, that have smaller setbacks, so buildings that are closer to the street. Things like relatively lower, more human scale buildings, more upright cross sections. And then people are less likely to walk in places where there just aren't any buildings at all. And so one of the things I've looked at is, how can we measure those things, again, across very broad areas? And now I'm sort of working into, okay, well, now that we know how to measure these things, who has access to them? Are there real disparities in where walkable streetscapes or walkable design exists? And so that's what I'm getting into with my work here in Maryland. Something that, so I had access to a lot of different data in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was really useful. But again, a real challenge of this work is finding appropriate ways of measuring these qualities on a very mass scale. Something that we have access to nearly anywhere is building footprints. This is something that we've done a good job of developing data sets from satellite imagery of where buildings are located relative to center lines. And so through that, we can get at setbacks. And so this is an example of how we might do that on a very broad scale. We've got street center lines and can look at, okay, how far away is the nearest building from the street center line? And this can help us try to understand where there's an intersection between more human scale design, so places where buildings are closer to the street, where you might have more potential to, to see in the window or somehow relate to that architectural space of the built environment, what was not existing at Piggy Plaza, and then also the destinations. So basically, like, where do you have this Venn diagram between these two aspects of walkable design? And so I've taken sort of the first cut at this with some investigations of block groups within the DC and Baltimore areas. where do you have both of these sort of qualities existing in the same spaces? And this map also, you can't quite see the legend down here, but this map sort of intersects, where do you have these walkable design qualities with what are the sociodemographics of those spaces? And so the green, the more green block groups are the more sociodemographically privileged according to this EPA Smart Location Database. And then the more purple ones are the more disadvantaged block groups. And you can see that in DC, so these are only the block groups that have that combination of high accessibility and sort of human scale design dimensions. In DC, those really tend to be focused in more privileged block groups. So there's a smattering sort of out the northwest corner. Petworth, Mount Rainier is a really good example of a place that is quite walkable and is also a little bit less wealthy and certainly more diverse. But then in Baltimore, a really interesting pattern emerges, which is that there's this incredible resource of walkability that actually exists within relatively disadvantaged communities. And so, you do have the sort of Fells Point area, but you also have a fair number of block groups within West Baltimore. And because this is just sort of the most extreme ones, there is more access and sheet and scale design in other ones as well, but those are just sort of the top of both of those scales. And then we can also look for mismatches. Where do we get one but not the other? So these are places where you have destinations, but maybe it's not actually that comfortable to walk to those destinations. So again, in DC, down sort of in the southern part of the city, there are places to walk to, maybe not the most comfortable place to walk around from just a design and scale perspective. And then likewise, certain areas of Baltimore, you start to see more purple in Baltimore in these places that are sort of mismatched that might have places to walk to, and then maybe you wouldn't necessarily, this wouldn't be that enjoyable to walk around in purely on the scale perspective. And I want to stress that this isn't getting at the sort of surface level texture. This is really just about the bones of the space. And so just to draw out a few sort of examples, interestingly, Pickey Plaza shows up sort of on one of these places that there's a lot to walk to. The scale just may not be very appropriate for walking. And then on the other end of the spectrum, so this is actually the neighborhood that Mohammed was just talking about in West Baltimore. Really, this huge asset of very human scale design bones. Not at the moment a lot to walk to in some of these neighborhoods, and so that could become an important. That could help steer the way that we're trying to better plan for walkability. Can we harness the scale resources these places have and give them that other part of the equation? At the same time, though, we have to consider that this may be a huge risk factor for gentrification. Sort of drawing on my research from the Bay Area, this is basically exactly what happened in a lot of gentrified neighborhoods in San Francisco. Really great design bones, add a few coffee shops, and before you know it, the place has gentrified. And so I'm trying to tie this into research that some of my colleagues in California are doing about risk factors for gentrification. How, is this a useful early warning sign, basically, for a place that we want to sort of keep tabs on and develop intentional policy around to try to give these communities resources without sort of tipping over into that gentrification space. That's me. I look forward to any questions you have.
Our next presenter is Noma Ugu.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me. My name is Noma Maxine Ugu, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and I'm also a Transportation Fellow with the National Center for Smart Growth. Today I'm going to be presenting a part of my dissertation study, which focuses on equitable access to electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. A bit of my outline, I'll go over my backgrounds, my research question. I'll focus mainly on the survey that I conducted and then talk a bit about previous and ongoing works and then a conclusion. So I know there's a lot of people from the public health in the room, so I'm going to start with the public health issue or the public health part of my project. Transportation accounts for about 27% of the total US greenhouse gas emission. And this is actually the largest sector that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Now, we know that electrification of vehicles can help us with combating climate change in different areas. Actually, a study from GeoHealth showed that by converting 25% of the conventional vehicles we have right now into electric vehicles, we could reduce CO2 emissions by about 242 metric tons. Now, that's a lot. Also, we see a lot of racial disparity when we talk about electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We talk about charging deserts. There have been studies showing that the Black and Hispanic majority subgroups are the ones who are, less likely to have access to public charging. Also, we see that just public charging is not very equitably deployed in different areas. To me, this, it's a public health issue, it's a social justice issue, but it's also an environmental justice issue. And my understanding of that is when, the environmental benefits from our different policies or different initiatives are not affecting, the general public or those who are most affected by the environmental issues. I think it's a big, okay. I think it's a big issue, and that is like the embodiment of my project. Also, another thing I noticed when I was doing most of my literature review was that when we talk about electric vehicles and charging stations, we don't have enough subset research that is particularly aimed at minority groups or low-income communities. Also, when I looked to the different surveys that were out, I didn't see any survey that was targeted to this subgroup, and that's why I decided to focus my research on that. Now, my big question is, what is the gap in EV between disadvantaged and advantaged communities? There's my dissertation has 3 major parts, but this is like an embodiment of the whole research and what I really want to talk to you about today. So in order to try to get, more of the perspectives of, minority groups, I decided to conduct an EV equity survey. It was an online survey. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes to complete. And then we sent it out to, we requested that adults who either work or live in the DMV area. They're open to take the survey. And then there was like $100 raffle incentive for doing the survey. But our goal was really to just understand the opinions of people when it comes to EVs and charging stations and know what their current situations is, how aware are they, and what do they like, what would make them want to consider EVs in the future, if not already. Now we hit the first challenge with after creating the survey and trying to do a lot of outreach and get responses. You see, even though we were clearly targeting certain subgroups, we still saw that we had more white responders, and it was very difficult for us to actually get across to the minority groups. We put flyers around, we sent email blasts, and then we went as far as sending out post mails to addresses or to block groups and zip codes that had majority minorities living there. So we did pretty good. We got over 700 responses so far, and the survey is still out. So, if you have any other means of outreach, we'll be happy to share the survey with people. But when we looked at, issues of familiarity and environmental awareness, we actually see not that much difference across the different ethnicities, right? When we ask people if EVs were better for the environment, we see, equal responses. So they're aware of, the importance of electric vehicles. We did see a little bit of difference when we asked if the gas prices was affecting people's desire to purchase EVs. We saw that minority groups were more interested in purchasing EVs because of the burden of the current high gas prices. However, when we ask questions about like how familiar they were with EVs, what they knew about it, things like that. We didn't really see much difference with the different ethnicities. But then when you talk about ownership, you see here very significant difference in ownership. More white ethnicity groups have electric vehicles. Then we also asked, what would you consider, or would you consider purchasing or leasing electric vehicles? We saw there was a lot of interest across the different ethnicities, but what I found most interesting was that the Black or African subgroup, they were interested in EVs, but in a far later future, whereas other ethnicities were more willing to adopt EVs now. Why would that be, you ask? One reason we saw was when we looked at charging infrastructure. Now we see a difference between the different groups of people. We noticed that, more of the ethnic white groups were saying that they could charge at home, whereas the minority groups were saying we can't charge at home. So there's this need for the public charging. They said we can charge, if we imaginarily had an electric vehicle, we would be able to charge at the stores next to us. We would be able to charge at the parks, things like that. So that just further portrays the need for public charging in these different neighborhoods. And then when you ask people who could charge at home, you see a lot of the white respondents could charge at home, but the non-white respondents could not charge at home. Also, when we asked them what would be the biggest reason keeping them from buying or leasing an electric vehicle, you see price obviously is the same for everyone, right? Price is a huge factor there. But, the Black and Hispanic groups said that their second largest concern would be the lack of charging stations, but that was not the same for, the Asian and the white population that we surveyed. So I thought that was a very significant finding. But I'm still in the process of analyzing the survey. We don't have our final results yet. But another part of my dissertation, once the survey analysis is complete, I will do an accessibility study on the Maryland charging station. So I have data on all the charging stations that we currently have in Maryland and try to do a network accessibility study to understand, are these different groups truly far away from charging, not just by distance, but also access to it, the price of it, and things like that. And we began some of this research. At the bottom, you'll see where we just did some exploratory analysis into the data, and then we paired the different household income levels in different work groups with how many charging stations they have. And then you can see, obviously, in the higher income areas, we see more charging stations there than in other areas. And then the next part, after I'm done with the study, the accessibility study, and comparing it to what we see in the surveys, will be to talk about policy. Now, what policies can we enact to help, increase the adoption rates and ownership of EVs in minority and low-income groups? And this is just a little bit of the work I've done so far on the accessibility study. The next steps will be trying to do like a comparison between the different neighborhoods to see if different areas have more accessibility or not. A bit of timeline for the rest of my dissertation study would just be rounding up this survey analysis, conducting the charging station accessibility study, comparing our findings, talking about the policy implications, and hopefully by this time next year, be preparing to defend this research. So I'm going to leave you guys with just a final conclusion. I don't have any findings or particular, results to give you yet, but what I want to say is, a quote by Richard Rogers. He says, "The only way forward is if we are going to improve the quality of the environment, is to get everybody involved." And I think that is the focus of my studies, trying to make sure that everyone is being carried along as we are trying to increase the use of electric vehicles and also improve the climate change issues. So I'm really hoping that at the end of this study, I will be able to help policymakers and planners to answer the most important question, which is what needs to be done to reduce the disparity in electric vehicle adoption. Thank you.
Robin Hewitt, from School of Public Health, is going to be our final speaker. Thank you. Yeah, probably.
So, first of all, such fabulous presentations. I am so excited, that this came together, and thanks to, Era and the dean and, Dr. Margara for instigating all of this. It's just fantastic. So today I am going to, do two of my roles. One is I'm faculty in environmental health over at the School of Public Health. So I'll give you a brief overview of my research as people here might be interested in collaborating. I'm interested. The other thing is I'm going to present some slide snapshots of 7, not 6. I messed up on that. Don't tell our biostat people that I can't. 7 other SPH researchers who are unable to come today because of other pre-existing conflicts. So there's lots of interest over at the School of Public Health. And so what is an environmental epidemiologist doing interested in built environment? And I have some newer things as well too, like integrative health. I'm an environmental, chronic disease, and spatial epidemiologist, I would say. And so for those of you in the back, I think you can't quite see this model, but this is air pollution in this circle, which is where most of my research, most of my past research has looked at environmental air pollution exposures in the ambient environment. Other stressors here, the smaller text says socioeconomic position, psychosocial, physical activity, things of that nature, noise, diet. The stress response is in the middle, and then this lower circle here is individual susceptibility. So that would be age, your access to things, your education level, your medical history, things like that. And I also cite where I stole this diagram from. Apparently other people are thinking of the same things. So as I mentioned, a lot of my research has been in air pollution exposures. So just putting one of the articles up here in case those of you did not know that there is a link between ambient air pollution and type 2 diabetes in adults. Another example is physical activity. Does environment make a difference for attention, stress, emotional outlook, and perceptions of health status? I've also worked with Dr. Jennifer Roberts, our first presenter, on some Washington, D.C., whether children have equal access to play areas. And then, so also my newer area is looking at how integrative health can maybe break the stress response, which is where all those circles overlap. So maybe as Patrick mentioned, arts. I mean, can we use the arts? Can we use meditation? Can we use physical activity to kind of reduce that stress response, whether it's to your toxic environmental exposures and your perception of them, and that you can't maybe do something about the stormwater floods coming into your house, or whether we can actually just calm people down, give people a little bit of space to deal with things. And so we presented at the Society of Behavioral Medicine and on an integrative health and spirituality panel, targets for adaptation of mindfulness-based interventions. We were looking at culture, modality, and the physical space, the environment, and the socio-cultural space too, for these kind of interventions. So that's a quick little bit about me. Moving on to our great faculty. So James Butler, Dr. James Butler, first of all, I always have to compliment James on his smile. He just lights up the room at the School of Public Health. So if you work with him or see him, that's just one of his qualities. So he looks at the social context of smoking. He does a lot of community-based participatory research, qualitative data collection in affordable housing. So one of his bullet points here, because I think you can't probably see my small font in the back, is secondhand smoke incursion in multi-unit housing. His quote was, "Turning the window fan around does not get rid of it." The impact of no smoking policies in multi-unit housing communities. So where can we smoke, and who enforces those no smoking policies? And also when I think the slide deck will be loaded. So I also put contact information for these folks up here, but feel free also to contact me and I can get you in touch with these great scientists, great human beings, as well as other people too, because I'm just tipping the iceberg right here. Dr. Carrie Green, who's in behavioral and community health, she wanted to present about the Woodlawn study. And it's another great study that started in 1966. It continues to the present day. It's in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. It started with youth who were attending first grade in one of 13 schools in the Woodlawn neighborhood in 1966. They're now conducting interviews. These people are now 62 years old. That's a lot of data, watching a lot of those neighborhoods change over time. She said almost 400 interviews have been completed to date, and she's been looking at health discrimination, living arrangements, neighborhood perceptions. They also attached some census data on the address at the time of the interview, and she puts her latest publication up here, Can Early Disadvantage Be Overcome? A Life Course Approach. Moving on, we have two sisters who are professors in epidemiology and biostats. They use a lot of big data and Google Street View images, Dr. Tu Gwen and Gwen. So this is just one example article from them. They used Google Street derived images and computer vision to characterize neighborhood environments, including green streets, dilapidated buildings, overhead utility wires. And then they surveyed California residents who went to the UCSF, University of California, San Francisco system for an outpatient healthcare visit between 2015 and 2017. So they ended up with over 214,000 patients, quite a few. And then they characterized their neighborhoods and looked at any associations with coronary artery disease, hypertension, and diabetes. And kind of what everybody in this room would assume they found, they did. They found that people who were living in communities in the highest tertile of green streets had a lower prevalence of those diseases. They also found that higher prevalence of or higher presence of visible utility wires and more dilapidated housing units also resulted in an increase in those diseases. Moving on to Elizabeth Aparicio. She is also a faculty member in behavioral and community health. She has, as you can see, mental and she's a social worker, also licensed, and she works on preventing violence and promoting sexual health and helping families thrive. So she's the director of the Community Thrives Lab. And so she's listed several of her projects up here. I'll just hit a few of these highlights. So they created Rosie the chatbot, which provides personalized health information for minoritized pregnant and new mothers. They work on fostering healthy relationships for LGBTQ and foster youth. Also, they work with homeless youth as well on sexual health and relationship building, work on parenting and mental health and maltreated young mothers. So she does there's a lot of things that this lab does that you might be interested in partnering with. And a lot of this is community engaged research as well. Dr. Jacoby Wilson is our Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, and he's a faculty member in environmental health in the School of Public Health. The mission of his lab group is to engage highly and differentially exposed populations in underserved communities with environmental justice and health issues. So very similar to what Rachel and Jennifer were talking about as well. They use community-based participatory research framework. They also use community science or citizen science and collaborative problem-solving models. They build partnerships to empower underserved and overburdened populations. And they create a lot of linkages between advocates, scientists, researchers, and students. So some of the things that I know he's worked on is like a bus depot was sited over in Bladensburg. The Bladensburg community came to him. He puts students out on the project, train them to collect data, lots of air pollution over there, and then they were going to add a bus depot as well. So you're going to overburden an already overburdened population. So we worked with the community to do that work and with students as well. And lastly, Devin Payne Sturgis, who is already collaborating with faculty here on a grand challenge proposal. She has a grand challenges application with Dr. Willow Lung and Dr. Nancy Raquel Mirabal. Her research and teaching overall focus on cumulative environmental health risks and social disparities. She used to be a scientist at the EPA. The grand challenge application that she has going forth with faculty here is to create a Center for Critical Urban Studies as an innovative space to examine critical questions of urban inequality and to find durable solutions through collaborative, community-based research and direct action organizing. And Devin has also just been awarded an NIH grant to look at immigrant communities and health on the Eastern Shore. So those are just the tastes of all of our work. And I also want to, we're working on details. We'll be talking with Tara more to organize the collaboratorium to get you guys to walk over to our space. We have a collaboratorium where we have set up for presentations and we have computers in there and access, and you can just enjoy coming to the School of Public Health, and hopefully we can get more people engaged that weren't able to make it today. So there will be forthcoming announcements about that. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Our next set of Q&A, if anyone has one right off the bat.
I have a question about the EV presentation. So you didn't talk about it, but you interviewed a number of groups about whether or not they would embrace the technology if they had access. And I noticed the first category you had was Native American community. And there was a high rejection rate of technology, 50% of the people said they wouldn't pursue it. And I wondered if you parsed that data at all.
Yeah, so that particular subset, I actually didn't want to go too much into it, but we didn't have as many people, we had less than 10 people respond in that ethnicity group, but yeah, so it's like the 50%, you know, if you're, it was like 2 people. So it's not enough for us to specifically say that, yes, they are, rejected the EV technology, yes.
That could be really interesting. So let's see on that. And there's a lot of money from the Bureau of, oh gosh, I don't know, Bureau of Indian Affairs related to climate change. So you know, if we wanted to drill down to that.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, we'll look into it.
I was just curious, in your survey, did you ask the question whether they were already going in cars?
Of using cars or using electric vehicles?
The car.
Yeah.
Cars.
Yeah, so there is a question, there is a whole section that asks about people's driving characteristics, so it's not presented, and this again, it's over 20 plus questions, almost 30. Depends on, like, some people may skip a question, so they get a different number of questions, but there's over 20 questions in the survey, but there's a whole section dedicated to driving requirements, and in there we do see who drives and who doesn't drive.
I want to identify these 3 locations. What are the next steps? How do you decide? How do you get them funded? How do you actually implement?
Excellent question. So the next step of the project that I did not cover here is actually we applied for an arrangement from CPWR, which is all about construction safety. So to assess the feasibility of converting any of these, all these 3 buildings into a community clinic. And I think that because, as you mentioned, it's all about, you know, the possibility and whether they have the potential. And a big factor here is actually the construction safety and water safety. And we are at the end of that project, so we just finished it and we scanned the buildings and came up with a final report. So based on that, these 3, out of these 3 buildings, we came up with 1 building that will be chosen. Of course, there are also other issues that were involved here, like for example, the ownership and, you know, all sorts of kind of around the legal issues that have to do with this building.
Yes. Well, we kind of 2 questions. One is a comment from you. You was asking about other places to improve. Have you checked out like the DMV just open out like on Saturday? People taking it for- not get a body sample level of half the cars, but the right is there, maybe it's been there for a while. I'll take your- You know, and then my question, for Chester. So I'm really good with the presentation, and so you were looking at, walkability in terms of high, access and human scale. Well, you know, when we're talking about human scale, we're talking about that physical built environment scale. And I was wondering, it's a hard question, I'm trying to answer, but how to really like interrogate having the human scale also incorporate, kind of a social cultural environment in the sense that I do a lot of work that looks at like walking while black, walking while black. So you can have a perfect human scale, perfect, you know, coffee shop and everything, but if you have that one black body walking, not his eyes looking, or there might be looking with a call, and even maybe if you are, maybe it was be a live body of art that shows different people going through whatever from a variety of different cultures or whatever. Maybe it's not so stark difference, but starting when you usually that means one body of color. But that's just a constant thing that I think about because I mean I had to have to doing like research and all of I want to go big on the sidewalk, if you're like intersection density, you can have all in place. But like I might be walking and still get stopped or you know, just or whatever. So to interrogate that constantly, not just focus on the you know, get taught on that or whatever. I don't know if there's a question there, whether it's talking.
That's fine. And I'd love to talk to you more. It's great to hear there are other active living folks, in public health. Yeah, I mean, I come at this from both a research and a practice background. And one of the things that I really always enjoy doing in the practice space is I worked at a planning firm and folks would sort of come to the data and mapping team, which I was leading, and say, you know, just like tell me the right answer. And you know, that was then basically never came to fruition. So I mean, trying to consider sort of where the boundary capabilities are for a quantitative analysis and then where the qualitative approach has to pick up, or a different data collection technique has to pick up. I think is crucial. I look at this work as being essentially sort of a high level scoping study. And then, yeah, getting down into the community and in other work that I've done, it's definitely been a sort of progressive mixed methods approach where you're finding a site where certain things overlap, and then you conduct interviews, and then you do surveys, and then you with knowledge in the space. And so I think it's hard for me to imagine us getting beyond that, and honestly, I'm not sure that we want to. You know, I mean, there's definitely real value in bringing those other methods to bear to understand both what the problem is and also where opportunities to eliminate that problem.
Just talk about workability because that was also part of the work that we did. And I mean, it's extremely complicated, right? Because the presence of the pathway does not mean that the area is walkable. And we have the most beautiful pathways there, but we're not using them because of these invisible factors that social factors. There are some, for example, in our project, we realized that you have a beautiful area, but there is just this tiny kind of little law that is being used to collect trash, and that's why people are avoiding them because of the smell. So it's quite interesting how workability is being affected.
I just have a little follow-up. One of the things I do have fun with this research area is that even if it doesn't sort of solve the problem in a holistic way, it gets folks, especially from the more traditional transportation here in planning spaces, to think, oh yeah, there's something else there besides just whether the sidewalk is correct, or if it's wide enough, or even whether there's a sidewalk at all. So while my missions definitely are not going to pick up on all that sort of that sensitivity and stuff, it at least gets the head in that space. Oh yeah, there's more going on.
Does the walkability work look at different users, and particularly I'm thinking about children, and the way they access the environment, and you know, to them what's walkable is not just the streetscape, it is the unofficial pathways they've carved out. How different is it when you look at our populations? Is it significantly?
Yeah, so that's another area, another direction I think in this research, more thinking about differences in geography, but I do like sort of what we're saying as well. I mean, they're actually different research about students particularly and their walking experiences. But I've been surprised at the degree of similarity in how people really come from very different backgrounds think about what feels like a comfortable space. But there are also sort of just norms of the inclusion thing. It's been just been pretty abstract. But if you can imagine Phoenix is wrong to enclosure the same way as Boston. And so there's some kind of differences there.
Not so much them, but it's parents' perception. So we see a lot of between boys and girls in terms of distance to a destination. If the distance is perceived to be further, girls are usually not as permitted by the parents. And that also varies by the gender of the parents as well. But in essence, boys have a lot more freedom and independent mobility to destination. So that doesn't walkability. Children.
Just another thing that I would add is that this can also depend on where the parents or the families coming from, because some of the countries they are more used to walk, right? In other ones, no, it's kind of a car-minded or public transportation. So I think that everything was also right. In a map, this would be interesting to see.
As an air pollution person, like enclosure is good and bad thing. So has anybody like balanced that the enclosure feel versus how much you're trapping or funneling air pollution?
I'm sure that someone has looked into this in sort of like a laboratory sense, just in terms of like, either the mix of those spaces. My hunch is that this would be a really interesting place to go as we get more advanced and just measuring in the ecological world where what enclosure levels are. We're not, there aren't really good obvious data sets to do that. Right. And so I can see that being interesting to study.
Actually, if you're interested, I know in Barcelona that we're looking at people cycling and walking, but then the park next to highways, and they put like a riparian buffer. But then you want to balance the exposure to thermals and your risk part outcome, cardiovascular outcome versus society at all, right? So it's like, okay, so which way, so most of those studies have actually done the balance. So, or, regardless if you're dead and ambient pollution, it's still better that you are out. I think even compared to people in, not just
Yeah.
being outdoors is crazy, one of my favorite times.
Well, I think we have the same in session 2 and session 1, so many questions. We're going to close with Dean Luciano giving us some closing remarks, and then you'll have plenty of time to interact in the next session. So thank you to all of the presenters, to the full public health department.
Great, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Jordan, for hosting here today, and we your team for putting things together. As already stated by Dr. Hewitt, that we want you to come visit us as well, the School of Public Health. So my name is Horace, I'm the Dean of the School of Public Health, a 6-year jurisdiction. And I'm going to start off with a brief story, because I told this thing story to Dean Jordan, Mohammed, to my team. And this goes back to my previous life. In my previous life, I'm a public health practitioner. right, working at the federal level, was honored and humbled to serve as the deputy U.S. Surgeon General for 5 years. And a year and a half as the acting Surgeon General. And as your Surgeon General of the United States, you wear a fancy uniform. I wore that uniform for 27 years. I was a career person, not a political appointee. So I'm a public health person, actually qualified to judge the Go figure. But in the midst of that, I remember early on in my time period, right, in the Surgeon General's office is, you know, the Surgeon General goes around and does a lot of public speaking, right? You show up, you talk, there's a message, there's an audience. And at some point, the handlers say, you have a talk this afternoon. And I say, fine, I'm all set. And they said, you know, well, it's a unique audience. I said, who are they? And they said, it's a bunch of architects and planners. And it's at the American Institute of Architecture downtown AC. And we're going to talk about public health. And I was taken aback because you get used to speaking to the general public, you get used to speaking to your own, to the public health world. But rarely did we have this sense of cross-fertilization. And I remember when I walked into that room, how suddenly I was overcome with this idea of this is the future of public health. For us to be able to achieve the goals, right? The Surgeon General was at what at that point? Was into something called the National Prevention Strategy. And the National Prevention Strategy talked about all facets of our society coming together and doing what? And making sure that we are striving for the health and the wellness and the well-being of our communities. And I remember thinking to myself at that point, oh, this is it. Because public health has to interact with the group of people who are building the buildings and designing communities and putting things together. Because if we aren't in cahoots on this mission of health and wellness, then we're not going to win. 6 years ago, when I came here as dean, one of the exciting features of being the dean of the School of Public Health here at the University of Maryland in College Park is that unlike most schools of public health, which are oftentimes aligned with medical schools, right? They're put out. We should be in Baltimore, right, Steve? My principal associate dean is here, right, faculty? We should be in Baltimore because usually our partners have the medical school, the nursing school, the pharmacy school. And yet one of the exciting features that I felt 6 years ago when I came here at Earth was those partners, those friends, those colleagues in the medical world are still going to be our colleagues. But in fact, I'm really happy that they're 30 miles away from us. Because in essence, what now has happened is we find the 21st century friends and allies. Right? We go over to the School of Engineering, we talk with the engineers, we talk with the policy folks, and yes, we talk with you here. 2 weeks ago, we were visited by these two esteemed members of your community. An idea flourished, an idea that said, hey, we got to do stuff together. This is an example of where we want to go. This fits into the strategic plan of our university, making sure we're working together, that we take advantage of each other's expertise, that we teach this to our students, that we incorporate this into our research, and therefore that we create ultimately society. This is what public health is about. Right? Public health, I like using the definition, CEA Winslow, 1921, a century plus ago, talked about public health as the 3 Ps. It's about preventing disease and injury. It's about promoting health and well-being with the ultimate goal of prolonging a high quality of life. But the second part of that definition is just as critical. Because the second part of that definition from CEA Winslow, 1921, talks about who is involved in public health. And it's not just the feds, and it's not just Prince George's County Health Department, and it's not just the Department of Health in our state. The second part of that talks about the partnerships, that in essence it goes from organizations or public and private groups, families, individuals. That's how we achieve public health. So as we began talking a few
weeks ago, as all this came into place under the leadership of your team here, came up with a plan. And it's a plan not only to gather, but let's do something unique. Let's think of a path forward. Here at the University of Maryland in College Park, at this place, at this point in time, to begin changing the world. So today we have an announcement for you, don't we? Then come up and tell us a little bit about this announcement.
All right, when I came here a year and a half ago, the provost who hired me gave me some money. She said, here's a pile of money, big ideas, go. And I've been holding back $100,000 of that money for the right opportunity, and this is the right opportunity. So I'm making that funding available for a seed grant project. This seed grant has all sorts of levels, and you'll get the call tomorrow in the email from me. It's open to TTK faculty, PTK faculty, part-time, full-time. So this broadens the scope with co-PIs from public health. So the requirement is that there's a partnership. It can be a junior-senior partnership, it can be a practitioner, traditional academic partnership, but partnership is the goal. There are short grants that allow you to come together and plan a conference and exhibit some project that you want to do. And there are roadmap grants, which allow you to come together to think about grants that you might apply for. And then there are some larger plans that make it possible for you to implement some grants that you want to try out. So $100,000 is still a lot of money. Dean Lushniak and his team put another $25,000 on the table as an added incentive for anybody who really meaningfully embrace this commitment to partnership, which is really the idea. Now, oftentimes with these grant programs, we feel like we know who's going to get the money. It's the people who are already doing the work, who already have the partnerships. So we're doing this a little differently. And when I mentioned this to our research team, he was like, yeah, I know about that. And Tara told him all the reasons it's a good idea. So what we are going to do is a lottery. This is an open application process. There will be a review committee that qualifies the application based on a number of factors. And you have to qualify at 65% and demonstrate that at least 65% of your proposal meets these obligations. And then it goes into a lottery. That way, new ideas, big ideas, things that might get tossed out because they're too big and too on the edge, can be considered as part of this. So we are really trying to see interesting progressive ideas. And the goal is to make this more inclusive. Now, if you're a student in the audience and you're like, she didn't say students could be involved, here's the strategy. Find one of these faculty members in this room and affiliate yourself really strongly, because they can use the money to buy equipment, to go into the field, to pay your salary, to pay their summer salary. The only thing that we took out of the caveat for this is that it can't buy out a course. Well, we are both tiny little ships, and so when we do that, we cause great waves, even if we don't intend to. So there are a few limitations. You probably are hungry and you want some more. You'll have to wait until tomorrow morning when I'm ready to send out the email. I thought of a couple of things after hearing the presentations today that I just want to consult with Tara on before it goes out. But I hope you're excited about this. Please take this as my personal huge investment and Boris's investment in this partnership, but in your big, beautiful ideas that will make us healthier, more remarkable places. So thank you for today. I'd like to thank Tara again for organizing.
And I'd like to thank the facilitators, all the presenters, our dedicated comms team that really got this out to School of Public Health for collaborating with us on this. It's been a lot.
It has been fun. So join us for a reception. We're just moving out into the hallway here.
That's great.
Hang out with us as much as you like, get to know us. And Robin, thank you for the presentation of the colleagues that couldn't be here today. I think that's really special. I hope you wrote their names down and are ready to send them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Very much.
We've been on Zoom and.